Thank you very much, and thank you very much for the invitation to come to Paris to talk about data sharing. We're here like a shot, of course, and thank you also to the organisers for organising the meeting on a Monday, which meant I had to come over at the weekend, obviously, and I took the opportunity to bring my wife with me so that I could address her continual criticism, unfair, obviously, that I'm unromantic. So thank you very much for the invitation to come and speak to you today. I think, as you said, I was here and the agenda says I'm talking about the pharmaceutical industry perspective. I hate to disappoint you, I can't really talk about the pharmaceutical industry perspective. I think a number of people in the pharmaceutical industry would be quaking in their boots if they thought I was to talk on their behalf. I can, of course, talk about the GSK experience of sharing patient-level data. And my wife says I can also speak for Andrew Freeman as well, which is also A+ as well. In a meeting around meta-analysis, I better also say that I am biased. Let's get that on the table. I've worked most of my working life at GlaxoSmithKline, or Glaxo Wellcome, or Glaxo as it was before then. And I met my aforementioned wife. She's appearing quite a lot in this talk, actually. I don't know quite what that is. At the company as well. So I do have that bias right from the off. As I say, I'm going to present my own views. They don't necessarily coincide with those of GSK, although it would be somewhat odd if my views weren't somewhat consistent with those of my company. I'd probably be having to look for employment elsewhere if that was the case. So with all those disclaimers, what am I going to talk about? I'm talking a little bit about the history of data sharing at GSK. The reason I want to do that is it might provide some insights around how data sharing can be encouraged across the clinical research enterprise, but also in other fields. I'm also going to say that because I'm old and I was there, so it gives me something to talk about from real experience. I'll show you some data on what's happened since we started sharing our clinical trial data. I was going to show you some examples, but on the train when I was coming over, I kind of realized those examples related to GSK medicines. And I kind of thought, I don't want to be up there trying to promote the use of our medicines. So I'm not going to show you those examples, but I will make some general comments about the types of research that have been undertaken with the data since we started. Along the way, I'll talk about some issues and opportunities. I think we've already discussed some issues around data sharing and incentives in the system. I'll try and look at some other aspects, maybe things that you haven't heard of before, particularly if it's just after lunch and you're all kind of a bit snoozy. I'd want to try and say, oh, I haven't heard that one before. That might be something to keep you awake and on your toes as we go through. And I will actually, as some of the other speakers have done, ask you a question halfway through just to make sure that you're paying attention. I also coach cricket, and that's what we do with the youngsters. We always ask them a question. So just to give you a bit of context before I get into data sharing, this slide summarizes our policy with regard to the public disclosure and sharing of information from our human subject research that evaluates our products. And you take it from the left-hand side, we post a protocol summary for every study. We post interventional studies on clinicaltrials.gov. Observational studies are part of this. We post those on our own register. 12 months after the end of the study, we post a results summary, again on clinicaltrials.gov or our own register. And we also make available the full protocol and the statistical analysis plan. Within 18 months of the end of the study, we will submit a full paper for publication in the scientific literature. And publication of that paper triggers others' disclosures. So we will make available, get my words out, the clinical study report from the study within 1 month of publication, where that's an approved medicine. And within 6 months, we'll list the study for data sharing on our data sharing system. Just to give you some context of what I'm about to say with regard to data sharing. And yeah, I'm going to brag, obviously, on policy. And this is the All Trials Transparency Index put together by Ben Goldacre and his group, which compared across companies their policies with regard to disclosure. And we're top of that league. Yeah, great. And I've just put on that slide sort of the numbers involved in terms of the numbers of protocol summaries, numbers of results summaries, numbers of CSRs, clinical study reports, and numbers of studies that are available for data sharing. Just to give you a sense of the scale of effort that's been undertaken at my company and other companies with regard to sharing information from clinical studies. Okay, going back to where we started on this journey, back in 2012 and before that, there are a number of policy discussions around should we share data? Should we share patient-level data from our clinical trials? A number of reports were issued. This is one from the UK Royal Society in 2012. I put one of the main conclusions from that report on the right-hand side of the slide, basically saying scientists should share their data, and they should share data in ways that people can make sense of that data so they can use it. Seems pretty sensible, pretty straightforward. What's the problem? And of course, I don't need to tell this audience, there are a number of benefits for sharing data. It enables others to look at those data, verify the publications, repeat the analysis that have been conducted in those publications to make sure that they are accurate and robust. Enables others to ask new questions of those data sets that hadn't been asked before, maybe refine scientific questions for further research. It helps to avoid waste if the data that's already been collected can be utilised to answer questions rather than collecting new data. And there's an ethical dimension to this as well, in that when patients agree to participate in studies, they do so on the basis that their information will be utilised to further scientific knowledge and understanding. So sharing the data helps us meet that ethical obligation. On the other side, of course, there are risks, absolutely. There's risks around protecting the privacy of the individuals who participated. And there's also a risk around misuse of data, whether that's inadvertent misuse or willful misuse, somebody willfully wanting to misuse that data, maybe try and identify the individuals involved in the study, for example. So why did we decide to share patient-level data from our clinical trials? Well, fundamentally, we believe that data sharing across the clinical research community, industry, and academia would benefit science and the progress of science and research. And we believed at the time, if we took a first step in this area, it would encourage others to do the same, such that those data could be shared across the community, as I said, for scientific benefit and for further research. And this is an extract from the paper that went to our senior management committee in 2012, and just stating what I've just said already, that we did this on a fundamental belief that data should be shared across the clinical research community. This was a big thing at the time. We even issued a press release, and apparently we're going to create a system that will enable research to access the detailed, anonymized patient-level data that sit behind the results of clinical trials. Well, I was a project lead. It's quite a scary moment, that was, because all we actually had was a 2-page proposal paper that had gone up to senior management, but now we're going to create a system. So that was quite a scary moment. It was a big thing. It was picked up by a number of news outlets, as shown on this slide. And Andrew Whitty, who was CEO at the time, tells a story where other CEOs from other companies called him and, how can I put this, politely said it wasn't a particularly good idea that industry should be sharing this data. So this was a big thing at the time, a really big thing. And we ploughed ahead, and in May of the following year, we launched our system where researchers could request and access patient-level data from our clinical trials. So how does it work? Well, on that system, we list studies that are available for data sharing. A researcher can come along to that site, create a login, identify the studies of interest, put those studies together with a research proposal, send that proposal with those studies through the system. That goes into the back-end system where the proposal is checked, make sure everything is in order. It then goes to an independent review panel, what we call an IRP, who look at that proposal and determine whether it has scientific merit. If it does, they say, yeah, you should go ahead and share those data with that researcher. Where that's agreed, we put in place a data sharing agreement, which has a number of requirements, including that the researcher only agrees to undertake the research that has been put forward in their proposal, that they will protect privacy, and that also they will publish the results, which is really important for us. Once all that's done, the data is provided in a centralized data access system. So the researcher can go along, log into that system, utilize software that's provided in that system to conduct their analysis, and hopefully publish the results. And I've just put this slide in just to remind myself and to make sure you understand it's not just the data. We provide the protocol from the study, we provide a data set specification document which describes the data and the data labels. We put in there also an annotated case report form which describes whether the data are from the case report form in terms of the database itself. And some significant things happened after that. Remember, when we first started on this journey, we wanted to encourage data sharing across the community. And it didn't take long for the rest of industry to start to do things. Under the auspices of the trade associations, FPIR and Pharma, industry issued a number of commitments, including that they would share patient-level data from their clinical trials. In the US, the Institute of Medicine issued a report saying that data sharing should be the expected norm. And the journal editors also issued a statement or proposal that data sharing should be a part of publications such that there's a commitment to do that, to be published in their journals. Now, as it happened, they stepped back a little from that and required only a data sharing statement, not that research should actually share their data, which I think is a step backwards in terms of data sharing. But nonetheless, these were significant events. And the system that we launched back in May 2013, clinicalstudyDataRequest.com, is now used by 18, I think it is, other sponsors, including academic funders. So there's a pilot being undertaken by Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, the Wellcome Trust, Cancer Research UK, and the MRC in the UK, where they're also using this system to share data from research that they fund as well. But there's a but. There's always a but. Always a but. And that but is, well, if I'm a researcher and I want to access patient-level data from studies listed on clinicalstudyDataRequest.com, CSDR as we call it, and I also want to access data that's in a different system, being utilized by a different sponsor, that's going to be a problem, because they're both using centralized systems that don't necessarily talk to each other. There's also a problem if a researcher wants to use software that's not provided in that central repository. How is that software going to be provided? That's also a problem. And we pointed this out in a perspective piece we wrote in the New England Journal about 3 years ago, saying that data sharing risks not living up to its expectations and vision because of difficulties in obtaining data from different systems. 3 years on, and it's happened. So this is a screenshot of 2 data sharing systems, CSDR.com on the left-hand side, a system called Vivli on the right-hand side, which launched last year. The Vivli system uses a Microsoft Azure platform to share the data. CSDR.com uses a SaaS platform. So if I was a researcher and I wanted to access Pfizer data, which is available through the Vivli platform, and Roche data, which is available through CSDR.com, doesn't work. So what's the solution to that? We believe the solution is that not that the data provider provides a secure environment for the research, but the researcher provides that secure environment such that they can securely download data from different sponsors and different systems and combine those data in their own system. Increasingly, we now are using this approach. So we add some requirements to the data sharing agreement around what we expect for that IT environment, firewalls, passwords, etc. But we're increasingly using this approach because we believe this is the best approach to enable further research from these data rather than there being a fragmented approach where different sponsors are utilizing different systems to provide data. So, has more research been conducted since we started? CSDR.com, there's a tab on there. I'd encourage you to go there. There's a metrics tab, get all the information around the research that's been conducted. These are the headlines. We've provided anonymized data for 266 research projects. Sounds like a big number, but we've been going since 2013. Is it a big number? Don't know. It's not going forward now. Come out with it. Oh, help. Oh, here it is. There we go. So just to dive into these data a little bit, of the 500 or so proposals that have been submitted, most of those go through what we call a requirements check. So we check to make sure that the research is aligned with the original informed consent that was provided by participants, the Wellcome Trust, who now run the independent panel check to make sure everything's filled in correctly. Most of those go through. There are some that don't meet the requirements. Again, you can click further details to find out why certain proposals didn't meet the requirements. For us, actually, it's been situations where the researchers actually aren't requesting anonymized patient-level data. They're requesting something else, which is why they didn't meet requirements. So of those, there's about 400 or so that go through to the IRP. Most of those get approved. There's a little loop there where the IRP may ask the researchers to address something that they identified in the proposal, but most of those get approved. And then a data sharing agreement is put in place. Now, unfortunately, this is the longest part of the process. It may or may not be because lawyers are involved. I don't know. Make your own conclusions. But this does tend to be the lengthy part of the process. But nonetheless, we do get through them in the end. So I think one there that couldn't be agreed, although a number, about 20 or 30, have been withdrawn by the requester or didn't respond to questions that we raised. So make your own conclusions as to why that might be. And as I said, we've provided 266 research teams with access to data, and about 50 publications have come out. So again, it's early days, but publications are trickling through. We'd like to see more publications, given the amount of research that's been done. We'd like to see more research in the first place, to be quite honest. But we want to see more impact from our data sharing efforts, to be honest. Now, this is where I was going to show you some examples of some of the research that's been conducted. But as I said, I'm not going to do that because they're GSK medicines, and I don't want that to be taken the wrong way. You can navigate into the system to identify and see the proposals, see the abstracts, see the papers that have been done for yourselves. You can put them into kind of a number of broad categories. There are a couple of studies which have sought to validate already published papers, and I think, John, the 323, the one that you showed, was one of those that used this system. Others have looked at methodology, looking at new ways to analyze data. So a number of proposals, a number of projects in that area. A number are looking at disease and prognostic factors, and a number have looked at subgroups within clinical trials that may have responded more beneficially or less beneficially, depending on what the outcome they were looking at. So that's what's been done, and this is an opinion piece put together by the original independent panel about 3.5 years after we launched, basically asking the question, is it worth it? And they concluded that it was critical to find ways to improve the use and output of the data before data sharing is done more universally. 3 years on, it's probably still the case that we need to show the value of data sharing, unfortunately, from my perspective. So, I said I was going to ask you a question. So, 5 minutes. Okay, don't worry. I'll get there, don't worry. I was going to ask you a question. So before I stood up in front of you today, show of hands, how many of you were aware that patient-level data from industry studies were available for research? It's not bad, actually. Not bad, but still some work to do. So I think there is a fundamental awareness question that actually the research community don't even know that this resource is there. This is a paper from the Yoda project, which was published just last week, or not a paper, an opinion piece, identifying that actually it may be a lack of expertise that means that where data is provided, nothing happens. That is why research projects don't go forward. And certainly we've had some situations where we provided data, gone through all those steps, and then nothing has happened. Is it because of lack of expertise? Is it because research interest has gone elsewhere? Is it because the postdoc that was going to do it didn't get funded? We don't know. So I'll just very quickly, I mean, this is a study that used data from CSDR.com, but also used real-world data from a UK database. I put this in to ask the questions whether we can share clinical trial data in a way that enables those data to be used with other types of data. Real-world data, genetics, genomics data. This is a paper that used, we've mentioned it before lunch, machine learning algorithm. Again, is this something we can do in the way we provide the data that would encourage or facilitate, if we want to do that, of course, these types of research. This is a crowdsourcing dream challenge that was undertaken a couple of years back using patient-level data from a cancer repository, looking for the best predictive model in a crowdsourcing challenge. That seemed to be quite a good way to encourage use of these data. And so, probably only 1 minute left, just to summarize. We've been sharing anonymized data now for a number of years. We believe that that encouraged others to do the same, certainly in industry. But it's kind of, could not more be done with these data? My senior sponsor at GSK, when I rushed into him and said, look, we've had 100 proposals. He said, why isn't it 1,000? Why are these data not used? There's a lot of, all the policy talk before we did this was that this was a great thing, that everything, people could use these data, but it's kind of been, it's been used, but it's kind of, So what can we do to increase awareness, increase expertise? What can we do to encourage use of these data, other types of data? Are data challenges a good way to encourage use and get focus in this area? I don't know. These are questions that I'd love your opinions on. So thank you for your attention. I hope you enjoyed the talk.
Thank you. We actually have time for a couple of questions. Yes, please.
Yes, hello. I'm Leo Held, Uni Zurich, and I'm pleased to report that I'm one of the 53 published papers that have used your data. And
what went wrong?
yes, so what I would like to say is, so I'd like to encourage you to do this further, because it was great for us. It was a great resource for methodological research. It was a little bit tedious to work on this external server. In particular, file transfer was not permitted, if I remember correctly. So could you say a little bit more about this alternative model that the academic or whoever provides a secure system? So do you check the security of that system? How does it work?
I mean, essentially, it's a trust system, essentially. So it says, we're going to provide you with the data. We're going to put some contract in place that you'll only use it to the specified use, you're going to protect privacy. And we trust you that that's what's going to happen. So rather than us have the data and be assured ourselves that that's happening. There's more of a trust system. I think that with that goes some responsibility as well. It's because if there was some issue that happened, maybe privacy was compromised, that would have a very chilling effect for data sharing. Let me tell you, I'm always having to argue the case for data sharing and these different approaches. And if something went wrong, people are always saying, well, about the risk of this and that and the other. So if something did go wrong, that would put a chilling effect, which I think would be a real shame. But it's more of a trust system to put that onto the researcher rather than be in the centre.
So do you have both options on now?
Yes.
Or? Okay.
Well, actually, I'll take this opportunity to ask a quick question
Sure.
as well. So since you mentioned the risks of privacy breach for the data, I was wondering, how do you guarantee that the data is anonymized, and did you ever have any breaches that were reported to you?
No breaches. As I said, if there was, that would be a pretty chilling effect. We anonymise the data, but of course, we can only reduce the risk of re-identification. We can't put that risk down to zero. The only way of making that risk zero is not to share the data. So we put in place requirements around the data sharing agreement, anonymization, etc., to reduce the risk of privacy breach, but we can't reduce that to zero. On anonymization, we're trying to utilize an approach which anonymizes the data but doesn't reduce the utility of the data down to zero. It's trying to get that balance right, which sometimes is quite hard because some of the studies are in small populations in rare diseases where the privacy risk is higher, but at the same time, because they're rare diseases, you want to make best use of the data. So it is quite a conundrum sometimes to do that.
Thank you for your...
Doesn't. Oh, yes, it's good. Okay. Sharing data requires the data to be good, to be well prepared. So did it change the practice in-house when to the practice of collecting and preparing the data, knowing that it was going to be shared, to be better described or better prepared? I don't know.
Not particularly, and that's because we have to share the data with the FDA anyway when we're making a new drug application. So we have to make sure that the data is robust, is collected properly, et cetera, to GCP standards, et cetera. So we didn't actually do much with regard to the data. Raw data set and answer-ready data set were already there. Indeed, the data set specification document that I alluded to was already there as well. So we didn't have to do a lot in terms of changing the way we work to share the data.
Thank you. Philippe, one more question then.
Yes. No, thank you. It's a very useful initiative, I think. Is there any risk of selective data sharing from some of the sponsors participating to your
So there's some sponsors sharing some of their studies, but not others. So most companies have a policy around which phases of studies and from what date they're going to share. So in that respect, if it's in that sphere, there's no selection. Now, of course, that may mean that if the policy is from a certain date and before that there's an important study, it may not be shared. But to try and address that, CSTR.com has an inquiry system. So if there's a study that you're interested in as a researcher that's not listed, you can submit an inquiry, and most sponsors will look at that to see whether they can share the data. And we've shared a lot of studies through that mechanism as opposed to listing it.
Let's thank our speaker.
Thank you.